What's up guys, Coach Matt here, and today I'm answering a question I received from you about SI joint dysfunction. And if you've been struggling with this and are bogged down with all of the conflicting information out there, keep watching because that ends right now. Okay friends, so recently I invited you to submit your questions and ask me anything. Whether it's strength gains you're trying to reach, nagging pain you can't seem to get rid of, or my take on the latest fitness trends. Monica on YouTube had a great question about SI joint dysfunction. She said, I currently have SI joint dysfunction. Now with me, the right hand side, glutes and quads, is 60 to 70% tighter than my left side. Now I've been watching a ton of videos on it, but there is so much conflicting information. Could you please do a video on SI joint dysfunction, what exercises to do, what not to do, and what causes it? But more importantly, how to make it go away. Monica, I hear you and I totally understand the frustration. First things first, I always recommend you guys see a specialist to get assessed before doing anything you watch online so they can see how you move, talk to you more about what's going on, and determine what the underlying issues are. I do offer virtual assessments, or you can find a specialist in your area. Now, keep in mind, you need to go get assessed just in case it might not even be SI joint pain. It might be something completely different, but that's why it's so important to go get properly assessed. Now, with that being said, I'm going to do my best here to share what I've seen work for my clients. The SI joint, short for sacroiliac, is where the spine and the pelvis come together. Now, dysfunction in this area is demonstrated by that inability for the pelvis and the sacrum to move properly. Now, we tend to think of the pelvis only being able to do this motion. Now, I'm going to use my trusty little yoga block. Envision, guys, that this is your pelvis, like the big giant bowl, right? So most people tend to think the pelvis only does this. So tilting front to back. We call that interior and posterior tilting. The kids call it twerking. So, however, the pelvis has to be able to move in 3 dimensions, just like every human, right? So think of it like this. So here's front to back, all right? Then we have laterally flexing, so like side to side. But then most importantly, we have rotation of the pelvis like this. And we're going to get to this in a little bit. When you lack any of these movements, the SI joint starts to take a beating, as well as the surrounding areas like the hips, the glutes, the thighs, and even the lower back. Now with SI joint dysfunction, there are a variety of different symptoms that range from, as we mentioned, pain in the lower back, the glutes, the pelvis, the groin, the hips, and the SI joints, pain when standing up from a sitting position, radiating pain down the thighs and the upper legs. Now, most people I work with have intense pain right at that SI joint. The pain is typically on one side, and it just kind of comes and goes throughout the day with no rhyme or reason as to when it's going to flare up. Now, this dysfunction is usually caused by either one or a culmination of the following issues. So lack of pelvis control. Remember what we just talked about, the inability to move in all 3 of those dimensions. Next up is poor hip mobility. More specifically, you lack either internal or external rotation. So think of that femur head that comes down, right? It sits inside the pelvis. It needs to be able to rotate really, really well. Next up is excessive lumbar extension. So we've all seen people kind of sticking their butt out and they have that huge kind of lumbar curve. A little bit of curve is good. Excessive, it tends to be really, really bad. And then lastly, it's that inability to divorce the hip movement from the pelvis or lower back. So what that means is that if you go to do something that requires a hip, so let's just say you move your knee up to your chest, that's a hip movement. But if your hip lacks movement and mobility, the lower back and the pelvis tend to kind of come in and help, and that's a recipe for disaster. Now, it might feel a bit confusing when you go to look for solutions online because some people tell you to stretch the lower back and the glutes. Other people tell you to strengthen the inner and outer thighs, and then others give you kind of a combination of the 2. Now, all of this could give you some temporary relief, but it doesn't really address the key areas that we just discussed, the pelvis, the hip joint, and lumbar extension. Now, before I show you my top 3 exercises you should do, there are a few things I want you to avoid because they put the body in a compromised position, just asking for problems to show up. Now, this doesn't mean you can't do these movements, but I'd recommend reducing the range of motion while you put more focus on things that will help your problem. Now, I know it can be hard to back off from being active, but you can't keep banging your head into the wall causing pain on a regular basis if you want the problem to actually go away. Now, here's what I would start to avoid. So think high box step-ups, where you big step up into those high boxes. If you have poor hip mobility, the pelvis is going to hike up. So for instance, if it's your right leg and you go to step on the box, Pulling that knee up to the chest is going to require the pelvis to hike up. And if your pelvis doesn't do that very well, this obviously is going to be a recipe for disaster. Next thing up is deep squat. So now think of the pelvis earlier. As you go into that deep squat, the pelvis is going to want to tuck underneath. Kind of think like that butt wink that we've all heard of. Next up, we have heavy deadlifting. Not that there's anything wrong with heavy deadlifting, but if you got some issues back there, you're going to just be put in some compromised positions. Like you might be tempted to move your pelvis a little bit. There's going to be some shifting going on. It's just not probably the best idea at this moment. Next up is stretching the glutes with a shifted lower back and pelvis. Now what I mean by this is when people tend to do like your typical glute stretch, so think like a pigeon pose. So you have that leg out in front of you and you start to lean out over it. What you don't see is, once again, the trusted yoga block, the pelvis will shift up towards the side that you're stretching, and you end up stretching more kind of like your QL, which is that piece of meat here on your lower back, as opposed to actually stretching the glutes. So you're not really even working on your hip mobility when you're doing that, you're just cranking on that SI joint area. And then lastly is the trunk rotation stretch. So this is the stretch where you lay on your back, your knees are bent, and you kind of go side to side, kind of like a windshield wiper. It's a great movement, don't get me wrong, and this is probably like the most recommended stretch that's out there, but if your SI joint doesn't move and your pelvis doesn't move, you're basically just cranking on things and not in a good way. So we've just established the cause of SI joint dysfunction and what to avoid, and now let's dive into some exercises that will start to give you some relief. They're going to focus on our three key areas, so rotation of the pelvis, hip mobility, and then spinal flexion, specifically in that lumbar area or your lower back. Essentially, we want to get these areas working the way they were meant to. And once you start to do that, good things will happen. First up is we're going to work on pelvis rotation. So as I mentioned earlier, we have to get that pelvis to be able to move like this. It's really good probably at doing this, but we need better at this. The only equipment you're going to need is something to sit in. Preferably you want to sit with your knees bent to 90 degrees like I am here. If you're a little above or a little below, it's not the end of the world. Second up, you need a foam roller. If you don't have one of these, you could also use like a roll of paper towels. You just need something small like this that you can actually make it roll like that. Because this is going to help us kind of guide the movement coming from our pelvis. So first thing we're going to do is we got to get our alignment proper, all right? So the biggest thing here is that you want to make sure your feet stay still, and we're going to start to think dragging the feet back toward me. So I'm at 90 degrees here of the ankle, the knee, and the hip, and my feet are just actively pulling back because I don't want to see your feet moving like so. Next up, we're going to put the foam roller between the inner thighs, and we're going to gently squeeze so we feel our inner thighs engaged. Next up is we want to round our back. So what I mean by that is imagine like you're doing like cat-cow and you're in that cat position, so you're as rounded as humanly possible. So it's kind of like from this position here. This is key. You have to be rounded because if you're in this kind of chest out, butt out position, the pelvis isn't going to rotate as well. We want to get maximal rotation here because that's the point of the drill. So when I say kind of pull your ribs down, blow your air out, get really rounded, and then your hands are going to be on your kneecaps. All right, so we got our position. From here, it's going to be a little tricky. This is not going to go well if this is your first time, but just trust me, it will come. The right femur is going to suck back into the socket as the left femur comes forward. If you do that properly, you're going to feel the top of your right hip kind of contracting. And then now we're going to shift. The left femur pulls back and the right femur comes forward. So think conceptually what's happening. That pelvis is turning like that. And then now we're going to go back the other way. Now a good guide here is if you can, stare down the barrel of the foam roller. And you should see that foam roller moving like this. Now what I don't want to see is your hips starting to wag like that. You're not a dog, don't wag your tail side to side. So if you see this, that's too much. And you're going to start to feel the sides of your QL. So that's that meat right here that we talked about earlier. I don't want to feel that. I want to feel the top of the hips. Now, you're probably wondering how much should it move? It kind of depends. If you've never done this before, you're probably only going to get about maybe a ½ inch to an inch tops. If you're pretty good at it, more like 1 inch to 2 inches. So let me show you guys from the side. So remember, you're still dragging those feet back, hamstrings are engaged, you're still rounded. Now watch, that's my right femur coming out, and then that's my right femur coming back. And you can see the gap between the left and the right. Forward and back. And this just takes practice. Another good tip that actually one of my clients taught me is they felt really more comfortable taking their hands on the roller and almost like using the hands to help roll the roller, and it kind of just helps guide the hips. Other options is pull the femur back with your hand and then pull the other side back. But it's just getting this motion. And you're going to start to notice after you've been doing this for a couple of weeks, like when you walk, you're going to start to feel that pelvis move. You're not supposed to walk like this. You're supposed to walk with your pelvis constantly rotating like this. That's where human movement comes from. It's all about the rotation. So start with these pelvis rotations, and then next up we're going to get into working on that hip mobility. All right, next up is we're going to work on hip mobility. And the most simple way to do that is what we call hip CARs. So CARs stand for controlled articular rotations, and it's basically a way of expressing all the movements that your hip can do. But more importantly, we have to figure out a way to make sure it's only the hip doing the motion and not that pelvis lower back. So we're going to use the floor and then some other strategies to kind of really lock that stuff into place. Only equipment you're going to need is something to rest your head on. A pillow, a yoga block works really well, and then obviously a soft surface. So if you're on a hardwood floor, grab a yoga mat, do something like that. Just make sure you're comfortable because you don't want to be driving your bottom hip into the floor. It's not very friendly. All right, so we're going to lay down on our side. We're going to use the yoga block as support. Now, here's where the details are. If you looked at me from the top, I want you to almost be like in a cannonball position, right? So what that's going to do is that's going to put us in that spinal flexion that I talked about during the pelvis rotations. So I'm here. Next up, I take my right hand and I want to pull my bottom obliques off the ground. So now my spine is flat. If I let my obliques sag, then my spine is like this and I'm hiking my pelvis. So I don't want to do that, and then once I start this movement, none of this can change, all right? It'll make more sense here in a moment. With your hands, you can hold them out here in front of you. You can hold here. Some people like to keep their hand here as a guide. It's whatever you feel comfortable doing. All right, so now we're going to move this hip. Now this gets a little tricky at first, but once you got it, you'll get it. From here, we're going to lift the right leg up, keep the knee at 90 degrees. You're going to slowly pull it up to your waist. Go up as high as you can without this changing. What I mean by that is if I go too high, I'm going to tuck like that and my pelvis has shifted. I want to limit that as much as possible. So we're basically knee to waist, and now we're going to lift the foot and the knee as one piece to open the door. Notice I haven't moved anything except my femur. Now this is the hard part. The knee stays still, and I'm going to lift that foot behind me. You're probably not going to have a whole lot here if you're watching this video, and you're going to feel that stickiness right there in the hip. That's what we want. That's that internal rotation. Now the hip goes back a little, we come down, and we pull back to that starting position. We freeze, and now we reverse our course, but I'm still staying solid here. Foot comes up, and then we lift the whole knee, then the foot, and we get back to that door position, and then we slowly close the door. That's one rep. We're going to go 4 more. So, knee to chest, open, rotate, swoop, back and down, pull through, reverse, foot, up, 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 and down. Now, go check your obliques. They probably collapsed, right? Because up when you're up here is when that pelvis is going to hike and your ribs are going to drop down to the floor. So don't let that happen. Let's go 3 more. To chest, open, rotate, swoop. And you're going to notice with all of these blocks in place, your hip isn't going to move as much as you think it should. And that's okay. Get really good at what your hip can do. 2 more. Rotate, swoop, in reverse, up, up, up. Get back to that landmark of the door, close it. Last one. Open, rotate, swoop, pull through, reverse, foot, door, and close it. And if you're doing that properly, you should have a lot of good stuff going on here right in this bottom of the butt cheek. All right, we're going to flip over and do the exact same thing for the left hip. Sure, I'm good and still in the shot. Here we go. So, same concept. Think cannonball, right? So I'm in flexion. Take that left hand, pull the obliques. This time, let's keep it here and just see if you feel your ribs pushing down into your hands. Keep the knee at 90. Up to the chest, open, rotate, and swoop down and back. Reverse, foot, up, up, up to the door, and close. Did you push down on your ribs or are you staying nice and tall? Open, rotate, swoop, pull through. Reverse, foot, door,
close. Let's get 3 more. Now, you're probably noticing, you're probably seeing on me, my left hip moves a little bit more freely than my right. Most likely you're going to have one side that moves pretty well and one side that does not. And sometimes there's even a correlation of the side you have some dysfunction on, you might tend to not move as well on that side. It's not always like that, but it's usual. 2 more. Open, rotate, swoop. Check in those ribs. You still in flexion. Reverse, foot up, door, and close. Let's go 1 more. Open, rotate, swoop, pull through, reverse, foot, door, and close that door. Alright guys, so that's how we do the sideline hip car to work on that hip mobility. And next up we're going to go work on that spinal flexion in the lumbar spine. Alright guys, so next up we're going to work on spinal flexion specifically in that lower back area. So why is this important? Because most people when they walk, because of our sitting lifestyle, our pelvis tends to shift, so we start to stick the butt out at all times. So this may look good and everything, but from a performance perspective, it's not really a good thing. We want to be able to have good control of not only that pelvis, but have access to more flexion. And that's going to make more sense here in a moment. So we're going to have 2 strategies here. One, we're going to use breath to kind of expand our range of motion back there. And then we're also going to use the breath to control the motion of pulling the pelvis underneath and then slightly sticking it out, right? So this is a little 2-parter. So you don't need any equipment, you just need something that you can be on your hands and knees on. So we've all seen cat and we've all seen cow, right? Which are great exercises. We're just going to kind of beef it up a little bit. So what I want to first do is I want to get as rounded as I can. Now, this is called spinal flexion, and a good thought here is to think like somebody has a candle and they're trying to burn your belly button. So my hand and thumb is a candle here. I'm trying to get as far away from that candle as humanly possible. Now, once I get here, I don't want to move. If anything, I want to get more height, okay? So now we're going to go 3 maximal inhales with maximal exhales. And so what that means is I'm going to try to inhale and feel like my ribs and spine are rising to the ceiling. Once I've reached maximal height, I don't come down, and then I blow all my air out like I'm trying to blow up the biggest balloon possible. And you're going to feel your ribs come down even more. Your abs are going to contract and you're going to feel a bigger stretch, and we're creating space in that lumbar spine. So let's go ahead and do that. 3 big inhales. So we're in this position. Inhale through your nose. And now blow all your air out. It's 2 more times. Big inhale. Feel all that expansion in your back, and now blow it all out. 1 more time. Big inhale. And big exhale. And if you did that properly, you're going to feel these tissues right on the underside of your ribs, pulling the ribs down and contracting. Those are your internal obliques, and you're going to feel a bigger stretch. You can always practice this drill. You can even do it sitting as well. You just put yourself in the same position. So this is how we just kind of expand and we kind of almost improve our breathing mechanics. And then now we're going to use it to move our spine. So what we want to do now is we want to get in this position. So from here, my upper back and my head stay still. I'm going to inhale to stick my butt out a little bit. And now I'm going to exhale to pull my butt back underneath me. Inhale, stick the butt out. Exhale, pull it back underneath you. Inhale, stick the butt out. Exhale, pull it back underneath. Every exhale, you should get more scooped underneath and fill your abdominals a little bit more with every breath. Let's keep going. Butt out. Butt tucks. You hear how loud my breathing is? That should be you as well. Work on blowing all your air out. Let's go 5 more. Inhale. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Don't lose your upper back. Be nice and flexed. Inhale. Exhale. 2 more. Exhale. 1 more. And exhale. One more thing to think about in this position is that a lot of people, they tend to stick their butt out way too far, and they start to kind of feel this kind of a combination of a pinch through here, but it also feels like a stretch sensation. It's not a stretch, it's a pinch. You don't want to feel anything. As your butt goes up to the ceiling, you should not feel anything in this position at all. If you do, you're basically taking the vertebrae and you're just jamming them together, and that's not going to be a good idea. So less is best on that. Think more tucking and only maybe a little bit of movement here. So you're just going to have to play with that and figure out where your body feels comfortable. So typically we do like 3 to 4 breaths in that nice spinal flexion position, and then we move into 10 reps of that lumbar flexion and extension, syncing it with your breath.
The key here is that you guys need to do these every single day. So be patient, and if you're consistent with this, you should start to see changes within a matter of weeks. Again, if you want to dive deeper and get a specific individualized assessment and a plan of action, you can always work with me virtually or look for a specialist in your area. Let me know how you guys did in the comments below, and I'll be back next week answering more of your questions. So stay tuned and remember to be strong, be mobile.